So, hello everyone, listeners out there. Welcome to Peter and Debra are doing a podcast with me, Debra Alcock-Tyler, and him, Peter Wanless. Peter, what have you been up to recently?
Hi, Twinny. Yes, I, like a lot of people, have probably been watching far too much football. We're confident. Well, Junior in this household is very confident England are going to win the World Cup. So we'll see about that. We popped down to the Barbers this morning and had a discussion about Turkey losing to Australia, and there was someone in there from Portugal, and we had a discussion about their manager. And so, football during the World Cup is the great kind of expression of cosmopolitan, multicultural Taunton. So lots of people are talking about the football and not just the cricket. And then in between watching football matches, our growth strategy in the garden continues apace. So we're eating as fast as we're growing potatoes and spinach and strawberries, and not on the same plate, but also weeding. And my goodness, so many weeds. I've spent hours pulling out by hand individual weeds from the driveway, which is, I guess it's like ironing or washing. It's a sort of chore that and this seems to be the time of year that at least I'm a bit more knowledgeable and I know what's a weed and what's a plant.
Oh, well, they're all plants, aren't they, to be fair? I mean, somebody said that all a weed is a plant in the wrong place. And I think there's something quite interesting about that. But I know what you mean. When I was waving Andy off to work this morning, I suddenly noticed a proliferation of weeds on we've got a gravel drive that's poking up, which I've got to do about. But yeah, weeding. I just, talking about weeding, which is going to sound like a really weird link, Peter, but I had a real pleasure this week of giving a keynote at the Mind Federation Leadership Conference. So for all of the local mines, for their chief execs, for their senior staff and stuff like that. And honestly, it's one of my favourite things I've ever done. It was like, they actually asked me to speak for an hour and a quarter. And when I started my prep, I was thinking, how the hell what am I going to talk about for an hour and a quarter, But actually, it turned out they were so receptive and so engaged that, the time literally just flew by. And in fact, in the end, I cut out quite a bit of what I was going to say because we'd run out of time and, they were so engaged. So they were absolutely joyful group of people. And I know that, some mines are doing quite well, but quite a lot of them are really struggling.
How many are there?
I think there's, I'm not sure. I think there must be at least 75, Peter, I want to say. And there are at least 150 people at the event. And there's all the challenges of federated charities, you've got to follow the rules of the overarching body, but nonetheless, you're all independent with, individual trustees and things like that. What is one of the challenges facing, not just mines actually, but I think our sector as a whole, is because we've created this culture of care, which I think we've done incredibly well in our sector. It's well understood largely in organisations that we have a duty of care and compassion to all the people that we work for. We've got to think about their well-being and stuff like that. And I think that's brilliant and right. But I think that what's happened for a lot of organisations is that they've confused this sort of culture of kindness and care with not holding people to account, not having difficult conversations. And, it's one of the things we were talking about at the conferences. It isn't actually kind to either the individual themselves or the people they work with not to tackle poor behaviour, not to deal with, people who aren't pulling their weight. And, and how sometimes the kindest thing you can do is sit down with an individual and say, this isn't working out. Come on, let's talk about how we help you to move on to a different place, and how much we tend to avoid that sort of thing. And so, it was just an interesting conversation. And there was lots of nods around the room. And in fact, one small group cheered when I said, we've really got sometimes to move people on, if they're not in the organisation. Yeah, although that's why I said weeds are just plants in the wrong place. Because actually the other thing I've noticed is people who we find difficult in our own department sometimes shine somewhere else. So it's not necessarily always that a person in and of themselves is difficult or lazy or underperforming. Sometimes it's just they're not in the right space. They're not working with the right leader. They're not in the right sort of role. So that's why I say weeds are just plants out of place. And so underperformers are often just plants out of place.
Yeah, it's a lot easier to have those difficult conversations when you've built a culture of psychological safety.
That's very true.
I think I guess I've kind of learnt over time that actually all the talk of culture and well-being and looking out for one another and breeding a culture kind of sort of it can sound soft and fluffy and allowing people to get away with it, but it really doesn't, does it? It creates that space for people to hold one another to account and have expectations of one another, as well as, if necessary, issuing kind of instructions and rules and procedures and requirements from the top of the organisation.
Yeah, that's
funnily enough, we had a little presentation. We had a Somerset Cricket Club board meeting yesterday, and our safeguarding lead, who isn't me, which is quite fun, talked to us about safeguarding and why it was important, not just about procedures, but becomes everyone's responsibility. But what does that mean, and what expectations do we have of one another? And I could see a few of the kind of very driven, high performance, you get it right or you're out, people who are in sport, and my goodness, we need them in sport to drive up performance. But at our club, I think, again, we've learned over time that when you build that sense of camaraderie and people looking out for one another and expecting a lot from one another, safeguarding is just another dimension of that. Actually, and yeah,
and because you're right, because I think we have the most wonderful culture at DSC. I mean, we, like many charities at the moment, are really going through the tough times. It's really hard work, and it's sometimes really dispiriting. But there's never any sort of sense of blame or people looking sideways at a manager who they think's not bringing in the dosh or whatever. So it's a really good culture. But the trouble is, getting to that space takes quite a long time. And if we're living in the less ideal culture, it's even more important, I think, to tackle people who are behaving in a toxic fashion. It's like, because I always say, like, if your perception of an individual is that it's not working, they don't fit in, it's, they're not cooperating, they're not pulling their weight, they're not, working with others. If you can see it, everybody else can see it too. And everybody else can see you not dealing with it. So in fact, not dealing with it actually contributes to people not feeling safe, because they think, well, they're just wimping away from dealing with this particular individual. And it's really difficult for leaders, isn't it? Because and I've seen this before, when I've done it myself, when I, have helped people to move on. People have seen that I've helped to do that, but it's also reminded them of my power to help people move on. So it also has the opposite effect of sometimes making people feel a bit more wary around you when they realise that you do have this power as a leader or as a manager in the organisation. So so I think basically you can't win as a leader. All you can do is do what you think is right for the organisation and what's going to keep things moving on, and just accept that some people are going to think you've done the right thing and other people aren't, or are going to feel damaged by it. And that's just some of the shit we have to absorb in leadership roles, I think.
And there will be variable performance, won't there, in any organisation?
Yeah.
So however happy and positive the culture is in DSC, I assume you've got, some people who are achieving more than others.
Peter, you won't believe me. Honestly, no. But then the difference in DSC is we don't, although everybody has their roles and they have their teams they work in, because we're so small and there's so much to do, nobody actually ever gets to just do their job. They have to do a lot of other stuff as well. So if you take, for example, Jose, our podcast producer. So Jose is nominally in marketing. So part of his job is marketing, particular focus on books, but he has to help with all of the marketing. The other side of that is he's our development manager. So he looks at any new products or stuff that we can develop and move into, to offer to the sector. So that's, for example, our governance app, which is, doing really well. That was Jose developed it. Jose got it out there. Jose makes sure it works and things like that. But on top of all of that, so this job of being the podcast producer is something he has to do on top of all of his other work, because we want to produce a podcast, but, and he's the one who basically volunteered. And on top of all of that, he's also our AI lead. So he's also doing training in AI. He's keeping up to date in AI. He's helping us manage internally our stuff on AI. Do you see what I mean? And that's true for every single member of our staff. And I think that because it's literally physically impossible to be in a silo, any sign of you not putting your weight in any direction, it doesn't elicit criticism. It elicits people saying, can I help? Or are you okay? Or can we do anything? And that tends to make people step up more, or be completely honest and say, I literally can't cope today. And their colleagues can say, take the day off, don't worry about it, we'll cover for you, which is what tends to happen. I mean, unfortunately, we can't really ask Jose because he's not supposed to speak on the thing, but I can see him nodding, you know, in the background. It's like that. But that's taken years, and also crises. Like, we've always had a good culture, but it became really much better during the pandemic and post the pandemic. Our culture's also got stronger because we work more remotely, and because we've done things to like break down barriers between managers and leaders and things like that. And, you know, so yeah, so there are, yeah, so honestly, however, it didn't used to be like that. And so we did used to have people, and also I'm not saying, because everybody has off days.
Yeah, there'd be good times and less good times.
Yeah, exactly.
Again, thinking about Somerset cricket, we had the most. You don't need to know and understand to be an aficionado in cricket to get what I'm about to say now. But Somerset beat the current champions, Nottinghamshire, last week away from home, and we only had half a team. We've got so many injuries and call-ups for England and all the rest of it, and it was an extraordinary victory away from home. At the start of the season, someone shared with me a statistic that despite Somerset being a very successful county and having been in the top division longer than any other county, we'd only won away from home one of our previous 16 games.
Wow.
Now, this season, we have won 3 out of 4 away games, and the 4th one we could and should have won as well. So this is
robbed.
this is a fantastic for a pretty high performing club where, you know, in another competition things aren't going quite as well this season, but we've been very successful there in the past. But what a learning opportunity to pause and ask ourselves, what is it that is different? Because no one wants to call anyone out. It's not like we weren't kind of successful, but it cannot be coincidence that you go 16 games and you only win 1 away from home, and then suddenly you win 3 out of 4 away. So what are the conditions that are, and what's happening? What could we secure from this experience to prepare for the future? And again, that just feels a very translatable moment, and the temptation is not to kind of stop and learn when things are going really well. The temptation is to have postmortems when everything has gone wrong and find out the reasons for what's going wrong. And it's so to a strengths-based appreciation is can be a really kind of effective way of taking things to the next level. I suppose it's a kind of good to great
that's so
philosophy.
Peter. And because if you don't look at what works and why it works, there's a real temptation to end up just flogging a dead horse. You know, we get that sometimes when we look at our public course offering. You know, there are some courses that are just really popular and do very, very well regardless. There are other courses we think the sector needs, but somehow or other they just don't book on it. And we shove a whole load of effort into those things that aren't doing as well, when actually we'd probably be better off shoving effort into things that are doing well, that people are booking on. So it's always trying to keep that, you know, balance in place. But actually, talking of cricket, see, this brings me to another big question, I think. So listeners who may not be as familiar with the cricketing world as Peter and I are, you may have heard that the captain of the England Test side, Ben Stokes, and a chap called Gus Atkinson broke curfew. What that means is that when you're playing for England, typically you're all staying in the same place and you're not allowed to go out partying or getting drunk and stuff like that. And there are good reasons for those rules. Anyway, Ben, who's the captain, and Gus Atkinson broke their curfew, went out clubbing and got into some difficulties in a club, which has resulted in an altercation, which is one of the reasons why they're not allowed out. Because, you know, if you're a famous cricketer or a famous footballer or famous footballer in the town, somebody's going to have a pop. Anyway, the result of that is Ben Stokes has been stood down, certainly for now, as captain of the England team, and Joe Root is playing. And Gus Atkinson also has been stood down. Now, I haven't heard yet how long any of the consequences will last, if it's just for this particular test, where they don't appear to be being missed, actually, because we did quite well yesterday. Anyway, all of that to one side. It just got me thinking about, because I was really angry about it, and I was shouting at my partner saying, like, he's the bloody leader. What business does he have with just breaking the rules? Like, if you're the leader and you don't agree with the rules, challenge them, change them. You know, have a look at, you know, how it could be done differently. Don't just say, well, they don't apply to me. And not only that, to like bring along a younger member of your team who actually hasn't played for the team. It hasn't been in international cricket for, I think it's about 2 years or something, is it? And thought his international career was over and has been brought back. And now all of a sudden you've put that in jeopardy. So I got really cross about it. And then I sort of started thinking, well, do we have unreasonably high expectations of leaders? I have to say, when I was young, very young and new at DSC 20, 25 years ago, I used to go out drinking with our staff and probably said and did some inappropriate things, and definitely some inappropriate things were said and done to me. And I look back now and I think if I'd had better judgment at the time, I probably wouldn't have done that. Anyway, so it's got me all activated about leadership and, so I just wondered what you thought, Peter.
Yeah. I mean, my instinct is that I'm not a great one for rules and procedures and regulations and all the rest of it. And maybe that's 20 years in government, seeing what a blunt instrument legislation is. That as soon as you try and write a rule, people will try and interpret it and push it at the margin, and there'll be difficult situations and all the rest of it. And so my preference is for adults to be treated as adults and to behave and believe in one another and self-regulate in the way which you've been describing DSC colleagues look out for and call one another to account when things don't seem quite right. The difficulty in this particular case is that England badly let down a lot of supporters who spent an awful lot of money over the winter going to Australia to follow them in what everyone said was this most important series. And the vice captain got into an altercation in a nightclub, and they had a fairly drunken few days away in the middle of the tour. And all of this kind of came out in the press. And so to rebuild confidence in the team and to demonstrate to the supporters who'd felt very let down that there was some discipline in this team and that they really did take their cricket seriously, there were going to be these rules, including not being out after midnight. So to then, at the first opportunity, break the rule as the captain, I agree, is a really difficult situation. And I do feel sorry for the other player, Gus Atkinson, because there's a power imbalance here, isn't there? And if you've actually, the game had finished, they'd won the test match, they were out celebrating. A number of the others clearly knew they were supposed to be home by midnight, and it's these two that carried on. But what would you do if you just got back into your team and your captain said, "Oh, come on, it's all right, let's do this"? So there's a differential situation there, and I think so. Generalizing that, I do think senior leaders, we are required to set an expectation and have a responsibility to behave at least by the rules, but probably above and beyond as well, because you are setting example, you are on display all the time. I think one of the lessons that I put in my contribution to your book about being a CEO was you're always on display, and the way in which you turn up and present yourself and what you do is observed the whole time, whether you like it or not. So if you turn up looking cheerful, then other people are likely to be cheerful. If you say that a rule is for other people and not for you, then that has implications not just for that rule but for every other rule. So it's I feel, do I feel sorry for Ben Stokes? I sort of do, because he's had a history of being kind of rather fragile in terms of his mental well-being and so on. So there's an issue here about how are you in this situation and what is the truth and what's being interpreted and misinterpreted and all the rest of it. But the rule is the rule. It was set very clearly. It was set for a reason, and he, above all others, should have
or have fought it. Because this is very opposite, given I've just come from the Mind conference this week. But I dislike this habit we have of excusing poor behaviour on the grounds of mental health or a condition, or you get people saying like, well, he's autistic, which is why he attacked that person. It's like no, you don't get away with that. And I've a lot of sympathy for Ben Stokes, because I know he struggled with his mental health, as I have, as you know, Peter. But that isn't an excuse for poor behaviour. The reality is you have to separate. And also, if he is fragile, then what business did they have appointing him to such a responsible role if he wasn't going to be able to, you can't have it both ways. You can't say, well, he's very fragile and he suffers from mental health, and that explains, the fact that he broke the expectations of him as a captain. Do you see what I'm getting at? Having said that, I do feel sympathy. I do understand it. And even people right at the top can, go a bit AWOL. But I think we have to, and I suspect Ben Stokes would not himself hide behind mental health. I think he would say, I didn't get that right. I hope he would.
Yeah. It's common, isn't it, in organizations to have super performers who are brilliant in their particular function, but are cavalier with or disregard or are not always consistent with the values of an organization, and that is a challenging leadership responsibility.
You can't have that person called the leader, Peter. That's the point.
And further and down the organization as well, if you're going to make a virtue of not just what we do but how we do it, then however brilliantly you do it, if you're not doing it consistent with the values, that has to be called out. And that's a challenging thing for a leader to do, but it has to be done. If you are saying and claiming and articulating, we are an organization which has fundamental values as well as fundamental performance. Well, an aspect of the performance is the value.
That's you're absolutely right. And it is, and I suppose we just need to be completely honest with leaders about it, especially the leaders stepping into senior leadership or into chief exec roles, is that, you need to know the truth of this job. The expectations on you are very heavy. You are just a human being, but the problem is, whether you like it or not, you are going to be expected to be able to be, exactly as you described, to be consistent, to live the values and all the rest of it, no matter how you're feeling. You have to be able to handle that pressure, and you have to be able to regulate yourself such that you can do it. And if you can't do that, because the trouble is, then don't take on this role, because the trouble is that we, it's the point you made earlier, is that people are always watching you. Like, you can be the most brilliant, brilliant's a very difficult word to describe to leadership, I think, anyway, but you can be an absolutely grounded, standout leader who's really clear about what the priorities are and do all of those things. And you can do that for 2-3 years. And then you make one walloping great mistake, like going out and getting pissed and being photographed in the street or whatever. And that's what people remember. And that tarnishes all of that good work you put into it up until that point. And I think that's what we've got to remember as leaders. It's like, it isn't fair, and it definitely isn't fair, but mistakes we make are magnified and turned into something bigger than they necessarily need to be. And you've got to be able to deal with that and be prepared to take it on and be prepared to try to be. I mean, I was saying to the Mind Conference, I'm basically not a very kind person, Peter. I have to work really hard to be kind to people. If people knew the thoughts that go on in my head, I've always said I'm terrified of getting dementia, not because of losing myself or anything like that, but I'm really terrified that my filters will come up and all the horrible things I've been thinking all my life are going to come burgeoning out. People are going to go, I never knew she was such a bitch, So, anyway, I think listeners hopefully have got the general point about, there's a lot of things that are unfair about being the leader. But, if you can't deal with it, don't do the job, because actually, if you get it right, you can make such a profound difference to the lives of the people you serve, as well as the lives of the people who work with you.
And everyone makes mistakes.
Absolutely.
This is a particularly stark example of a person at the top breaking a rule which was very visible to everyone and put in place for a reason because of something that happened before. But maybe there are other rules which exist because of something that happened in the past and are less relevant now, and this is why I think it's a good idea to sweep away rules which aren't really required, because they do lead to these kind of black and white difficulties. But if you find yourself on the wrong side of a rule and you're able to own it with appropriate humility and explain the situation and seek forgiveness, then I also think in our sector we're generally speaking not a kind of one strike and you're out culture, unless you've abused a child or something.
Although it's human beings, we find it hard to forgive especially people who we've looked up to as heroes. That's like, please don't put me on a bloody pedestal. Don't ever say I'm brilliant or wonderful. You think I'm amazing, because I promise you I'm not, and I'm going to fall off it. I'd just much rather you saw me as a normal human being who's bumbling her way through life, doing her best not to cause too much damage, like most of the rest of us. But unfortunately, you know, our psychology as human beings is such that we like to have things to look up to, things to represent us. And so me shouting, you know, please don't see me like that, isn't going to change the fact that some people will, and I will inevitably let them down, you know. So God, it's hard work being a leader. Why would you bother? Somebody said to me years ago, Deborah, what advice would you give yourself before you first took on a chief exec role? And I was like, don't do it. Do something entirely different. Trust me.
Funnily enough, I kind of feel the reverse, and that I was nervous about the idea of being a leader and never expected to be a chief executive, and spent the first 10 years of my life as a private secretary and a speechwriter and a kind of advisor, and I was always going to be the person that was going to serve things up for others. But that's not the way it ended up, and now I feel very much that it's quite challenging to be a cog in someone else's show and to ask them questions and let them make the decisions. And if someone's going to appear before the select committee and account for what the organisation has been up to, well, I'd rather it was me than anyone else, because at least if I understand why things are as they are. So there are great kind of privileges and aspects of being a leader that are less stressful than being a middle manager.
Yeah, that's very true. The squeezed middle. Actually, so still thinking about that then, Peter, and thinking particularly your role at NSPCC. So I want to talk about the social media ban. I don't want to talk about it in and of itself, because, you know, we've talked about this many, many times before. But I was really interested, and I noticed that a number of NSPCC alumni have written to the Board of Trustees of NSPCC saying that they're very upset about the NSPC stance on this, which appears to be quite positive, like this is a good thing to ban social media, it's good for parents, it's good for children. And this alumni have said, we don't support this, we don't agree with it, you know, we're really disappointed you've made a decision, please change your minds. Now what that struck in me was this perennial challenge we have in our sector, actually in our lives, about the views and voices of the people we serve versus the views and voices of the people doing the work and who have the bigger picture. And if I think about, you know, the children, it's, you know, adults invariably tend to think they know better than children. Personally, I don't subscribe to that, because I don't think we do. We know what our childhood was like. We don't know what their childhood was like, because we're not experiencing it. But that's by the by. But I think that's also the same in organisations and boards of trustees as well, when we have a tendency to think that actually you've said this, but in fact, there's a different way to look at it. So I was just reflecting on how difficult it is to, if you say you're going to, you know, honour and respect the voice of lived experience in your organisation, whoever that is, and then what they want to happen, you know, is either really bad for the organisation or really bad for them. How do you handle it? And also, before I let you answer, also the other challenge is that voice of lived experience is never the same. So you'll have one group of people with, you know, arthritis saying one thing, and have another group of people with arthritis saying something entirely different. So again, they often conflict. So given, you know, your experience, Peter, I wondered what your view was on that.
I think it's quite a tricky situation for the NSPCC, because of the emphasis and the primacy that we have been putting on the voice of young people, and the voice of children and young people being a distinct contribution, the debate that they're able to bring to the table and others aren't. And I think some of the people who feel let down in this space are rather like the backbenchers who are sent out onto the airwaves to defend some government position, only to find that the Prime Minister has announced a 180-degree U-turn, and it's now something, and you think, well, what did you ask me to do that for? So I think there's an element of, you know, the debate has moved over time, and what was announced was not just a social media ban, but we talked last week about I felt we've been going on so long here with so little progress, there needed to be some sort of a circuit breaker, but there had to be a step changing and plan and all the other things around it. So I think there's a way of having a conversation with the campaigners who were out there arguing a arguably less kind of sophisticated, slightly more polarized position, and they've clearly felt confused or left hard. And it's not for me to explain quite all the nuances of the NSPCC's position.
No, but
and their statement
general,
wasn't very nuanced, but in general,
how do you manage
I think you have to. I think all of us have to listen very carefully, don't we, to lived experience, individuals and organisations, and appreciate their perspective, but not necessarily always agree with them. Not all young people have the same view on this issue, and some people who used to be young people and are now older people feel differently about it than when they were young. When I was at the Department for Education, years ago, there was huge skepticism about the value of anything children and young people said, because of a feeling that there'd been in the 70s, there'd been all this sort of trendy child-led education, and young people saying what they wanted to learn, and standards really kind of slipped, and that kind of sense of you don't know what's good for you when you're young. We will tell you what is best. There was some legitimacy in reacting to that. I was going to say the lunatics have taken over the asylum, which is very unfair for children, but that kind of sense of they are stakeholders in the conversation, but they're really, really important, and their perspective and their understanding and their experience has to be heard and valued. And I don't think it has been through this process, and there have been disproportionate efforts to listen to the tech bros relative to the young consumers, absolutely, for sure. So I would want to be a champion of the voice and perspective of lived experience, and try my best and encourage organisations to do their best to listen and appreciate and debate with them, rather than giving anyone a veto. And if you do shift your position appreciably, those people need to understand why. Otherwise, they say they're going to feel like the backbenchers who've been left high and dry.
Yeah, there's a phrase, isn't there? Nothing for us without us. But sometimes what's for us, and there's a reality in it. Sometimes the things we think we want are not the things that are going to be good for us. There's a truth there, isn't there? Difficult to manage, but I think the key message to listeners here is, if you are involving people with lived experience, make sure they feel heard, even if you end up not doing what they want. Although there is a phrase, a mate of mine used to say, isn't it funny how people think that if you haven't agreed, you haven't listened? Which is so upsetting, isn't it? Because you listen really hard and absolutely get the point and still not agree. So anyway, we've run out of time, Pete.
Okay.
Jose's waving at us frantically, saying, "Get off, get off!" A bit like when I was doing my speech.
Get back to the weeding.
Yes, get back to the weeding.
We've had an hour and a quarter of this. It's not good for our mental health here anymore.
Yes.
Very good.
Thank you, listeners, and we'll
see you next time.
Next week.
Bye.
Bye.